The wind moved softly across a concrete airfield somewhere in Europe, carrying with it the sharp smell of gasoline and oil. Engines idled in the distance, their low growl blending with the metallic clatter of tools and boots on steel. Long before bullets began to fly, before cities burned and oceans filled with wreckage, the war had already started here, quietly, methodically, inside supply depots and motor pools. That in Germany, officers of the Wehrmacht had learned a hard lesson from the First World War. Horses could no longer carry armies. Speed decided everything now. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, none of them mattered without fuel. And fuel, if handled poorly, could slow an entire offensive to a crawl. The solution rested in the hands of ordinary soldiers, a rectangular steel fuel can, solid and simple, designed not for comfort, but for survival. It could be dropped from a truck without splitting. It could be opened in seconds, even with shaking hands. 3 handles allowed it to be passed quickly down a line while shells burst nearby. When the lid snapped shut, it sealed tight, no funnel needed, no fuel wasted. By 1940, German columns pushed through Europe with frightening speed. Panzer crews refueled under fire. Truck drivers worked through the night. Fuel flowed forward, almost effortlessly. The steel cans bore dents and scars, but they did not break. To the men using them, they were unremarkable. To the enemy watching from afar, they were invisible, yet decisive. Across the Atlantic, American military observers studied reports from Europe with growing concern. The speed of German advances shocked them. This was not the slow grinding warfare they had expected. Something was different. Something beyond tactics and generals. In Washington and Detroit, planners came to the same conclusion: mobility was the future of war. And mobility meant fuel. When the United States began its massive wartime buildup, factories were ordered to produce everything at once: tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, and the small tools that kept them alive. Among those tools was a fuel can that looked suspiciously familiar. The design was copied almost exactly: stamped steel. Rectangular shape. Same capacity. On blueprints, it was perfect. In reality, it was not. The American-made cans arrived in North Africa in 1942, stacked high on trucks baking under the desert sun. Soldiers dragged them through sandstorms, dropped them from tailgates, and forced stubborn lids open with bayonets and wrenches. Fuel seeped from weak seams. Caps jammed. Gasoline-soaked uniforms and evaporated into the desert air. Private James Carter knelt beside a transport truck as drops of fuel splashed onto the sand. "Third one today," he muttered, holding the can upside down. "Still leaking." His sergeant swore quietly and waved him off. Every drop lost meant another vehicle waiting, another mission delayed. Nearby, British troops watched with tired expressions. They had seen this before. One of them finally spoke, almost casually: "You're using the wrong cans." Carter looked up. "They're brand new." The Brit shook his head. "German ones are better." The words hung in the air, uncomfortable, almost offensive. Better? Enemy equipment? But as the days passed, the truth became harder to ignore. In the desert heat, American cans warped. Sand clogged their vents. Fuel expanded and forced its way through weak seals. Engines coughed. Convoys halted in the open, vulnerable to air attack. Men cursed not the enemy, but the equipment in their hands. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lines, German soldiers refueled quickly and moved on. Oberstleutnant Karl Weiss locked the lid of a fuel can with a sharp metallic snap and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Full," he said calmly. Around him, the desert war was already beginning to turn against Germany. Supplies were tightening. Fuel was becoming scarce. Yet the container itself never failed. Even as their situation worsened, the design held firm. The contrast was cruel. One side had fuel but lost it through poor design. The other had the perfect container, but not enough fuel to fill it. As the war spread, the problem followed American forces everywhere. In the jungles of the Pacific, salt air corroded poorly sealed seams. Fuel contaminated engines. Marines struggled to open caps slick with rain and mud while enemy fire cracked through the trees. On airfields, mechanics cursed as precious aviation fuel leaked into the ground. One officer slammed a dented can onto the tarmac and shouted over the rain, "We can fight the enemy, but we can't fight this." The early clashes of the war were teaching a brutal lesson. Courage was not enough. Firepower was not enough. Even numbers were not enough. War, it seemed, could be lost one small mistake at a time, and somewhere between factories far from the front and soldiers kneeling in sand and mud, 8 tiny design details, overlooked, misunderstood, ignored, were already shaping the fate of men who would never know their names.
The first helicopter rose into the air just as the eastern horizon began to pale. Its sling low swayed beneath it, an awkward, priceless mass of metal and circuitry, while tracer fire snapped upward, far too late and far too scattered to matter. The desert swallowed the noise, as it always did, leaving only echoes and confusion behind. Inside the radar compound, Captain Viktor Sokolov stepped carefully through the wreckage. Where the antenna once turned with patient certainty, there was now only an empty mount and dangling cables swaying in the breeze. The silence felt heavier than any explosion. "They took everything," one of the officers said, his voice hollow. Sokolov nodded slowly. "Not everything," he replied. "They took what matters." Miles away, Israeli helicopters skimmed low over the sand, racing the sunrise. In the cargo hold, Sergeant Amos Levin braced himself against the vibration, his arms aching from hours of work under fire. He looked at the radar components strapped down like wounded soldiers and allowed himself a single, exhausted breath. "We did it," someone said, disbelief creeping into his voice. Levin didn't answer. He was thinking of the men who hadn't spoken since the first shots, of the moments when a single mistake could have turned the mission into a massacre. At the airstrip, ground crews ran toward the landing helicopters as soon as the skids touched down. Engines screamed. Trucks backed into position. The radar pieces were transferred with frantic efficiency, hands moving faster than tired minds could follow. A senior intelligence officer watched in silence, then finally spoke. "Get this into secure storage." "Nah." As the sun rose higher, the political shockwave began. In a distant operations room, Soviet advisors stared at reports that made no sense. No bombing. No sabotage. No destruction. Just absence, a complete system. One general demanded. "Yes, Comrade General," came the reply. "Remote intact." In one night. The room fell silent. Back at the desert site, Captain Sokolov wrote his report with mechanical precision, every word weighed carefully. He knew careers would end over this. He also knew the truth would be studied far beyond the borders of this conflict. He paused, then added a final line. Enemy demonstrated exceptional planning, technical knowledge, and audacity. Weeks later, engineers in a secure hangar worked beneath bright lights, carefully reassembling the radar. They traced circuits, tested frequencies, and learned its strength and its weaknesses. Pilots listened closely as analysts explained what the radar could see, and more importantly, what it could not. In the air, confidence returned. Future missions flew lower, faster, smarter. Warnings came earlier. Losses fell, yet for the men who had been there, victory felt strangely quiet. Sergeant Levin returned home carrying no trophies, only memories, the weight of a wrench in his hands, the sound of gunfire cutting the dark, the fear that clung to every second until the rotors lifted them away. Years later, Captain Sokolov would tell a younger engineer, "Never assume your enemy only wants to destroy you. Sometimes, he wants to understand you." The radar he helped build never returned to its hilltop. The desert wind continued to blow across the empty foundation, erasing footprints, smoothing scars, pretending nothing had happened, but something had. The night proved that wars are not decided only by battles, but by minds willing to risk everything for knowledge. That courage is not always loud, and defeat is not always explosive. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon in war is the one that disappears before the sun rises, leaving both sides forever changed by what was taken and what was learned.